All right. Hi, everyone. So, my name is Brett Anderson, and this is part one of what's going to be a 10-part series of videos called Intimations of a New Worldview, which is a little bit of a pretentious name for a series of videos, but whatever. That is what I'm going to call it. And in this first introductory video, I'm just going to talk about what it is that I'm going to be doing here, what the problem is that I'm going to be grappling with in this series of videos, why I became interested in this topic, and I'll get into a little bit of content at the end as well. So let's get into it. I should probably tell you first a little bit about myself. So I am a PhD student at the University of New Mexico. I study evolutionary psychology there. I've published papers on the diametric model of autism and psychosis. That's kind of my main area of research. If you're not familiar, this is just the idea that autism spectrum conditions and psychosis spectrum conditions are cognitive and genetic opposites, and I think that's correct. I think there's good evidence for that. I also published a paper with John Vervaeke and Mark Miller last year on relevance realization and connecting my work on the diametric model with John's work on relevance realization and predictive processing. And I mention that because I assume that many people watching this will probably be familiar with John. I assume there's going to be a lot of overlap in our audiences. And then I've also published on some miscellaneous topics. You can find that on Google Scholar or my ResearchGate or something. So I also have a Substack called Intimations of a New Worldview. So it's the same name as a series of videos. And on that Substack, so if you're not familiar with Substack, it's kind of like a blog or a newsletter that you can pay for, although I haven't set up payments yet. I'll do that pretty soon. But on that Substack, I talk about topics ranging from complexity science to cognitive science, evolutionary psychology, morality, or my critiques of morality, let's say, and mythology, and the meaning crisis. And the link to that is in the description, and you should go subscribe to it. I talk about Nietzsche a lot. I mention that because it's true. If you find me at a party and you start a conversation with me, I'll probably find some way to insert Nietzsche into the conversation. Nietzsche is my greatest philosophical influence, and he'll play a large role in this series of videos as well. So what am I doing in this series of videos? What is the point of me making this? This is my attempt to communicate the solution to a problem, my attempt at solving this problem. And if I'm being honest, right, I don't want to be, overly modest, and I don't want to be overly dramatic, let's say, but I do think it's a solution to the problem, or at least it's been a solution for me personally to this problem. And the problem is both personal and cultural. Personally, it's a response to something that happened to me in my early 20s, and I'm going to talk about that in more detail on the next slide here. Culturally, it's a response to what John Vervaeke, the cognitive scientist John Vervaeke, has called the meaning crisis, or what Nietzsche referred to as the death of God. And I'll talk about that quite a bit in this first video here. It's the same as the problem that Nietzsche understood as nihilism. Nihilism is the rejection of any idea of objective value. In the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche said, and I quote, that all the sciences have now to pave the way for the future task of the philosopher, this task being understood to mean that he must solve the problem of value, that he must fix the hierarchy of values. And this is another way of talking about, Nietzsche is referring here to the reunification of fact and value, the reunification of is and ought. This is why he says that all the sciences must pave the way for this, because the sciences are giving us, our best methodology for discovering facts about the world. And we must use the sciences to fix the hierarchy of values. Well, that's what I'm going to attempt to do in this series of videos. No big deal, right? Should be easy. So my obsession with this problem grew out of a personal issue that I had in my early 20s. And so I'm going to tell that story here. I'm going to be relatively brief about it. I don't want to take too much time with this, but I think it's important to set the context for what it is that I'm doing here, and I assume that some people will want to know. So I had a relatively normal childhood. And I mention that because of what happened next when I became an adult, let's say a young adult. I don't think that anybody could have predicted what was going to happen based on my childhood. I mean, I was just a normal kid, right? So I grew up in a small town in North Arkansas. I had working class parents. I played sports growing up. I had a good group of friends in school. went to college on an ACT scholarship where I was in a fraternity there, and things were going fine for the first 19 years of my life. And when I was 19, so I was home for winter break after my first semester in college, and I had an anomalous experience. And I'm not going to go into detail about that. It's an experience that many other people have had. I'll say that about it. And I'm going to write about this at some point. I'm going to be vague here because I think it would be a distraction for me to go into detail about it here, but I will write about it at some point and tell the full story. But so I had this experience, let's say, and as a result of that, in the course of having this experience, I slipped into psychosis. So I had a psychotic break, and it was really bad. I was hospitalized for a little bit. I was put on very high doses of antipsychotic medication, which only served to make me worse, and they really did make me worse. And I know they made me worse because when I got off of them, I got better. And the first one lasted for probably 5 or 6 months. And I was delusional. I was manic. I was behaving erratically. And I was not pleasant to be around during that time. And I alienated people. I was very angry about things. And but anyway, so after 5 or 6 months after the first one, I kind of got better. Like I wasn't really better at that point, but my mania faded, my delusions faded kind of, and I went back to school. So I went back to school at that point. So I had a scholarship which was put on hold, and I went back to school, and things seemed to be going fine. So I was doing fine, let's say, in my social life and in school, basically. But at the end of that semester, I had a bunch of homework that had piled up that I didn't do. So I say I was doing fine, but like I wasn't really taking care of my responsibilities, and I had a bunch of homework that piled up, and I had to get it all done in like a couple of nights. And so I took a bunch of stimulants, and you may be aware that stimulants can induce psychosis, and that is exactly what happened. So I stayed up for a couple nights with stimulants, and I had another psychotic break after that. And that one lasted for probably 3 or 4 months. And although the first one was more intense in terms of my experience, the second one was worse in some ways because at that point, I broadcasted my delusions on Facebook. So I had about 1,000 friends on Facebook at that point, and I broadcasted the contents of my madness to everybody who I had ever known in my life. And that was, when I got better from that, when I calmed down, let's say, I was extremely embarrassed by this, and my social life was gone after that. I also left school at that point, and so my scholarship was gone. So they put my scholarship on hold the first time, but they did not do that the second time. So I was done with school at that point. And so my life was just totally upended by this thing. And so I ended up moving to Florida because my mom had moved down there. And I moved in with her for a little bit so I could go back to school. I went back to school and got my associate's degree, but my GPA completely tanked. I was very lazy because I was just... and this is an excuse, but I mean, I was just very confused and distraught by what had happened to me. I had no clue what to do. I was pretty hopeless for the future. I didn't really know what the hell I was going to do with my life. And I didn't know if this was going to be something that, that I would get better from. Right. And so I was down there for a couple of years, and, so something else happened. I had girl problems basically, but as a result of this other event, I had another psychotic break. So this was the third time. Again, this one lasted for 3 or 4 months. In the meantime, I had recreated my Facebook, and I broadcasted my delusions to everyone that I knew again on Facebook. And at that point, I moved back to Arkansas. I moved in with my grandmother, who was very kind to take me in, and she's been extremely kind to me about these things. And I got another job, and that's pretty much where I was at the age of 23. So that all of that happened from the ages of 19 to the ages of 23. And the last 7 years of my life, so I did get better, and I'll talk about that on the next slide. When I was 24, I got better, and I got better pretty suddenly, pretty acutely. But I'll talk about why that happened on the next slide. But the last 7 years of my life have been spent really trying to understand just what in the hell happened, and why it happened, and why I got better, and what I can do about it, let's say, and what what I have been doing about it. And I have been obsessed. And I don't say that lightly. I mean, I don't do anything else. So this problem that has occupied me for the last 7 years, this is all that I do. I mean, I wake up in the morning and I go to work on this every day. Now, I say every day. I've definitely fallen off the wagon a few times. I've gotten lazy a few times and distracted, let's say, but I always get back on it pretty quickly. And this has been the focal point of everything that I do for the last 7 years. And so this is kind of me coming back to share what I've learned with the class. Hopefully I've learned a little bit over the last 7 years. I mean, I've put who knows how many thousands of hours into this. So hopefully something of use comes of it. And it is the case. I haven't done anything else for the last 7 years. So of course I have responsibilities, right? I go to school, I have a job and all this, and those are my responsibilities. But in terms of everything, all of that is the only reason I do any of that is to further this project, right? Everything in my life is cultivated towards this project, and everything is judged in relation to how it contributes to this. And so this has been has been what I do for the last 7 years. And so I did get better, right? In 2016. So that my psychotic episodes happened from 2011 to 2015. In 2016, I was 24 years old, and I came across the lectures of Jordan Peterson, this very controversial dude these days. Controversial because of basically what was a political controversy, and I could have cared less about the political controversy. Kind of, I'm not politically involved, let's say, so it's not something that really matters to me. But I thought that he was an interesting character, and I began to watch and listen to his lectures, his class lectures mainly. And in the course of listening to these lectures, I had a series of insights. I had a series of kind of light bulb moments. And I began to put myself back together. I was a broken egg at that point, and I did start to put myself back together. And so I formulated my goals. I began to eat and sleep properly again, because I wasn't doing that at all before. And I quit smoking. I'd been smoking cigarettes for something like 7 years, maybe at that point, and about a pack a day or more. And I quit just because I knew that I would not be able to study properly when I went back to school if I didn't quit smoking. And I quit wasting my time on video games. So I'd been distracting myself with video games, basically, to avoid having to think about the catastrophe of my life for the most part, And I went back to school, right? And I went back to school at that point. And, I did really well when I went back. And I say that just because of, when I got my associate's degree, I did not do well at all. My GPA was terrible, and even though I got the degree, it was not good. And so I went back, and I did very well when I went back. I maintained a 3.9 GPA, made a B in genetics and a B in physics 2. Who cares? But and I published a couple of scientific papers while I was there, and that all of that stuff helped to get me into my PhD program. And that's where I'm at now. I'm a PhD student at the University of New Mexico. And the point is that I got better. And as far as I'm concerned, I didn't just get a little better. I got better than I was before. And, I think I'm on a better trajectory now than I would have been otherwise. Before my psychoses, let's say, it's not like, I was a normal 19-year-old, but it's not like I had myself together, really. I didn't have any real direction in life, and I definitely do now. I don't know if it's a good direction. I think it is, but it's definitely a direction, right? I've had a focusing, I've been very focused for the last 7 years, let's say, and I got better, right? And so because I brought up Jordan Peterson, I feel like I have to say something about this. So over the last 3 years or so, I, like many other people, have become increasingly disillusioned and annoyed with Jordan. And this is mainly because of his online persona on Twitter, really more than anywhere else. He also made some very questionable YouTube videos where he read from a script. But I've seen this sentiment from many people who were previously pretty uninhibited supporters of Jordan Peterson, who have become increasingly disillusioned with him over the last few years. Ever since he came back from his illness, he's been different. And his illness, by the way, if you're not familiar, he became addicted to benzodiazepines, and I would argue through no real fault of his own. He was prescribed them by his doctor. He was prescribed them for very good reasons. He had some very terrible things going on in his personal life at the time. But he was unable to come off of them without really bad withdrawals. He had withdrawal symptoms that were basically unbearable and could have killed him. So he had to be put in an induced coma. And ever since then, something's been off with Jordan. And I'm not the only person to notice it. So I'm going to read what David Fuller wrote about this, because it's basically what I think too. And David Fuller said this last year in an article about this. In short, the tragedy for those of us who valued his contribution is that over time, he has become more and more the caricature that the worst of the media coverage always said he was. While some of the reasons for this are entirely understandable related to his ill health, for me, his current disposition and reduction to a political culture warrior risks contaminating much of his legacy and value to the conversation. And I agree. On Twitter, Jordan comes across as being hyper-partisan and petty and gullible. The recent gullibility thing was that he retweeted this BDSM fetish porn because he thought that it was some kind of Chinese experiment. I won't go into detail about what it was that he was retweeting, but it was kind of, I want to keep this family friendly to some extent, but and he's very obnoxious on Twitter, in my opinion. And this sucks for somebody like me, because I love Jordan, and Jordan Peterson essentially saved my life, and I will always be grateful for that. And I do think that whatever his mistakes may have been, he's done far more good than harm, in the sense of helping many, many individuals put themselves together. But yeah, in the last few years, he's become increasingly hard to defend. I don't find many of the things he tweets to be defendable at all. I think that a lot of it's really dumb. But I am grateful for what Jordan did for me, and his work in Maps of Meaning will serve as a foundation for the ideas in this series. Maps of Meaning is and remains the most important book I've ever read in my life, and it's really not even that close. It's a very difficult and strange book, but Jordan got to the bottom of something in that book, and he spent 15 years writing it. He ought to have got to the bottom of something, and he did. And I will cite Maps of Meaning throughout this series. And I admire Jordan Peterson. I admire the work that he did as an academic. I admire what he did in Maps of Meaning. And I admire his lectures. This is why he became famous. He's a brilliant lecturer. Perhaps, easily the most entertaining and informative lectures that I've ever listened to. And I've listened to quite a few lectures in my life. And that's why he became famous, right? But this person that I see on Twitter, especially, and in these like scripted YouTube videos that he did, I don't admire that person, and I want to avoid becoming like that at almost all costs. So it is the case, right? It is the case, however, that I had these 3 psychotic episodes, and that Jordan Peterson's class lectures especially were instrumental in helping me to put myself back together in the wake of that. And what's so interesting about this is that I'm very far from alone in that experience. Many, many people have said something similar about the effect that Jordan's class lectures had on them. This was true even before he became famous. So he was voted at the University of Toronto. He was voted, I think, like the most life-changing lecturer multiple times while he was there. And so he's always had this effect on people. And it kind of makes sense because he's a clinical psychologist and he's extremely well-read in the clinical literature. So that is what he does for his job, is to help people put themselves together, and it seems to transfer to his lectures to some degree. So I'm going to read something that Jordan said about this. You can find this in this Akira the Don video, The Call to Adventure, and I'll put the links to everything in the description. He said, and I quote, "The fact that I know that the information I'm purveying is helping people to sort out their lives, thousands and thousands of people, it's overwhelming, and it's great. I know it's working because I get thousands of letters from people. Mostly they say one of 2 things. One is that I've given them words to articulate things they knew but didn't know how to say. And the other 3/4 are from people who say, I was in a dark place. And they outline the particular kind of darkness that enveloped them. And they say, well, I'm trying not to lie. I'm trying to adopt responsibility. I'm trying to formulate my aims. I'm trying to rectify my relationships. I'm trying to improve myself. And it's really working. Things are way better, and I'm back from the brink, and I'm better for my family, and I've got hope for the future." And that was precisely my experience. That was precisely my experience. And so I believe him when he says that he gets these letters from people, because I could say the exact same thing. And so, although I draw from a wide array of sources in this series of videos and in my work in general, it is the case that Jordan's work in Maps of Meaning has played a foundational role for the ideas in this series. And so I'll be citing it often in this series of videos. So it was of course Jordan Peterson who woke me up from my nihilistic slumber, you might say. But my greatest philosophical influence has definitely been Friedrich Nietzsche, the 19th century German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. And I'm going to read something that he wrote here. You know, the thing about Nietzsche for me is that I relate to Nietzsche in a way that I've never related to anybody who I've ever read or anybody who I've ever met. Nietzsche was obviously, a lot smarter than me. He was made a full professor at 24, and he was a ridiculous genius from a very early age. But in terms of temperament, I think that we have some things in common. I'm going to read something that Nietzsche said about his own period of sickness, and I quote, "I have often asked myself whether I am not more heavily obligated to the hardest years of my life than to any others, and as for my long sickness, do I not owe it indescribably more than I owe to my health? I owe it a higher health, one which is made stronger by whatever does not kill it. I also owe my philosophy to it. Only great pain is the ultimate liberator of the spirit. Only great pain, that long, slow pain in which we are burned with green wood, as it were, pain which takes its time. Only this forces us philosophers to descend into our ultimate depths and to put away all trust, all good-naturedness, all that would veil, all mildness, all that is medium, things in which formerly we may have found our humanity. I doubt that such a pain makes us better, but I know that it makes us more profound." Nietzsche's a little bit dramatic sometimes, but I agree with that, and as for my own period of sickness, I am grateful for it, despite the fact that it kind of sucked. I am grateful for it, and I know that the ideas that have emerged out of it, the ideas that I'm going to discuss in the series, wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for the terribleness of it in some sense. And I do think that these ideas may have some value. They better have some value, or else the last 7 years of my life have been for nothing. Nietzsche is, of course, most famous for declaring the death of God, and that's often misunderstood. People think that Nietzsche was like rubbing the rise of atheism in the face of religious people, but that's not what Nietzsche was doing at all. He was really talking to atheists. He's talking to the kind of Enlightenment type folks, and he was saying, look, yeah, God is dead. We killed him, and you have no idea what we've just done, right? It's not a trivial matter, right? We've cut this long tradition which has served as the foundation for the greatest civilization in the history of the world. We've cut this tradition off at the knees, and there will be consequences. There have been consequences. Nietzsche recognized that our shared cultural values were supported by a set of metaphysical presuppositions that we could no longer believe in, largely because of the rise of the scientific enterprise. But not only that, right? The influx of ideas into our culture as well. Nietzsche believed that nihilism, right, the radical rejection of all meaning and value, was the logical conclusion of the Western moral tradition. Larmor, in summarizing Nietzsche's position, described nihilism as the realization that there are no objective values, and that's especially true of moral values, because in the West, the whole Western tradition was focused on morality, really. It was underpinned by a moral value judgment. And Nietzsche believed that this realization would lead to a profound crisis in Western culture. And so this is how he described the development of that crisis. He said this in an unpublished work, which was going to be published. He planned on publishing it as The Will to Power, but it never. He went insane at the end of his life, and he never got to publish it. So I'm going to read what he said about this, and I quote, "What I relate is the history of the next 2 centuries. I describe what is coming, what can no longer come differently, the advent of nihilism. This history can be related even now, for necessity itself is at work here. This future speaks even now in 100 signs. This destiny announces itself everywhere. For this music of the future, all ears are cocked even now. For some time now, our whole European culture has been moving as toward a catastrophe, with a tortured tension that is growing from decade to decade, restlessly, violently, headlong, like a river that wants to reach the end, that no longer reflects, that is afraid to reflect." He goes on a little later to say, and I quote, "For why has the advent of nihilism become necessary? Because the values we have had hitherto thus draw their final consequence. because nihilism represents the ultimate logical conclusion of our great values and ideals, because we must experience nihilism before we can find out what value these values really had. Nihilism is really just another way of talking about what John Vervaeke has called the meaning crisis. Christianity is no longer the implicitly acknowledged shared worldview in the Western world. And that's especially true within intellectual culture. And it never will be again, right? At least not in its current form. It's not coming back. And so, yeah, lots of people are still Christians, but not the people who have any long-term influence on the culture, right? It's just the way it is. In their book, Zombies in Western Culture, Vervaeke and colleagues said this about it, and I quote, "For much of our recent past, we in the West lived all under the canopy of Christendom. However varied or populated our society was, other human beings always offered a degree of predictability as long as they identified as Christians." And the fact that we don't have a shared worldview, right, what they call the sacred canopy, this poses a big problem. It poses a problem for our ability to communicate and cooperate with each other. And we'll talk about why that's the case probably in part 7 of this series. So Vervaeke and colleagues described this loss, right, this loss of our shared worldview. He said about this, and I quote, "In the West, we are realizing with divisive discomfort that our Judeo-Christian model of meaning, which occupied our teleological awareness for over a millennium, was unprepared for the post-scientific world into which it was ushered. In our contemporary division of the sciences, burgeoning naturalistic accounts supported by a dawning comprehension of the brain, much of our scriptural teleology no longer satisfies us to our core, and our previously personified, cooperative universe can no longer be trusted to hold us in its favor. At no one moment in particular, we as a civilization lost the anchorage by which we could govern and organize a sense of the absolute." And this is the same thing as the crisis that Nietzsche was describing, right? This is the logical conclusion of the Western tradition. As Vervaeke and colleagues suggested in their book, there is no going back to what was lost. Right? Not within intellectual culture, right? I realize lots of people are Christians, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about intellectual and artistic culture, which is the kind of culture that has a long-term effect on the culture at large, generally speaking. That worldview is gone and it's not coming back anytime soon or ever. If the worldview of Christianity is eclipsed by secularization, they say, then there is no viable way to recapture its potency as a meta-meaning system. This means that we need to find alternative systems of meaning. As it turns out, such systems are not easily recreated. So, the scientific enterprise, right, along with our knowledge of other cultures. And because this is partly due to the scientific enterprise, I think it was also partly due to the influx of ideas from other cultures. The famous Richard Dawkins argument that, do we believe in Thor? Do we believe in the Hindu gods? Well, then why would we believe in the Christian God, right? That doesn't make any sense. And of course, Dawkins is being perfectly logical about that. So these forces have made it so that educated people can no longer believe in that worldview that supported the Western tradition in the same way that we once did. Bernard Reginster is a Nietzschean scholar and a philosopher, and in his book, The Affirmation of Life, he explains Nietzsche's position about why the loss of the Christian interpretation of the world would necessarily lead to a kind of crisis of meaning, at least among the intelligentsia. The mainstream Christian worldview interpreted our suffering in this world as an atonement and preparation for life in another world that would justify that suffering. As Paul said, without the resurrection, Christ's death was meaningless, right? That was Paul's claim. And so our suffering in this world is an atonement and a preparation for life in another world, right? That was the Christian interpretation of suffering. And what Reginster says, and he's summarizing Nietzsche here, is that the rejection of the Christian interpretation has terrifying implications simply because this interpretation gave an answer to the problem of suffering, right? It gave suffering a meaning. And for those who suffer, let's say, that's kind of an important thing. In the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche said, and I quote, that man, the bravest of all animals and the one most accustomed to suffering, does not repudiate suffering as such. He desires it. He even seeks it out, provided that he has shown a meaning for it, a purpose of suffering. the meaninglessness of suffering, not suffering itself, was the curse that lay over mankind so far. And in the wake, and that's the end of the quote, in the wake of the loss of the Christian interpretation of the world, Nietzsche says, and I quote, that nihilism appears at that point not because the displeasure at existence has become greater than before, but because one has come to mistrust any meaning in suffering, indeed in existence. One interpretation has collapsed, but because it was considered the interpretation, it now seems as if there were no meaning at all in existence, as if everything were in vain. Right, so nihilism is not a consequence of suffering. Right? It's not a consequence of displeasure. Right? It's a consequence of having no interpretation of that suffering that renders it meaningful. Right? That's what nihilism is, essentially. And so Nietzsche's contention was that we need a new interpretation or a new worldview, which in all reality is actually not new. Right? It's actually old. It's actually very old. But it's a return to an older worldview. We'll see what I mean here in a minute. Nietzsche saw the loss of the Christian interpretation in the Western world as being a transitional stage, right? It wasn't supposed to be anything final. He didn't think that this was like the end of the world or anything like that. It's a transitional stage out of which something new and more complex could at least potentially emerge. In The Will to Power, he said, and I quote, that the supreme values in whose service man should live were erected over man to strengthen their voice, as if they were commands of God, as reality and as a true world, as a hope and future world. Now that the shabby origin of these values is becoming clear, the universe seems to have lost value. It seems meaningless, but that is only a transitional stage. So Nietzsche saw modern nihilism and this modern cultural chaos as a problem, right? It's clearly a problem, but he also saw it as a great opportunity, as all chaos. And we'll talk about this more later on in part 2. All chaos represents both a problem and a potential opportunity. Out of the cultural chaos of the modern world, Nietzsche believed that a new way of life might emerge that could synthesize and overcome the contradictions inherent to what came before. John Richardson is a philosopher and a Nietzschean scholar, and he describes this process in his book, Nietzsche's System. In the post-Christian Western intellectual culture, he says this about it, and I quote, "Where has society arrived on the whole? The long dominance of the slave morality, which is Christian morality, has spun out many new practices of a more complex and spiritual sort than those of the younger society. Theoretical efforts at truth are among these practices. Science is among these practices. The relaxing of the slave's Christian values brings ever more tolerance of diverse types. No way of life is agreed to be better or more moral than any other. All lie on an equal footing, juxtaposed in person and society. This great pool of possibilities is no longer pressed to any single end. Thus they lie available as raw materials that can be taken up actively and into a richer and subtler synthesis than was ever possible before." So, of course, if you have a dominant interpretation of the world, it's very difficult to explore and to question that interpretation from within that culture, because, of course, you won't be tolerated, right? You will not be, deviation from the dominant interpretation is not tolerated. And of course, we like to burn heretics all the time. But the Christian interpretation of the world led to a state of great tolerance for competing interpretations. And as the Christian values have relaxed, those competing interpretations of the world now are kind of battling for dominance, you might say, within Western culture. And that admixture, right, the sort of cultural chaos of the modern world in which no way of life is considered, at least by any majority of people, to be better than any other, is a kind of potential out of which a new synthesis could emerge. And so that's another way of thinking about my goal in this series of videos, which is the creation of a new synthesis that unites the modern scientific pursuit of objective knowledge with the best of our traditions. So what does this have to do with my personal problems, right? And why do I even bring those up? It is the case, and this sounds a little cheesy, but I'm going to say it anyways because it's just the case. In the wake of recovering from my psychoses, I had an intuition. I began to believe that there was a mode of being in the world, a way of being in the world that might prove to be redemptive. And I was obviously in desperate need of redemption at that point in my life. And I've spent the last 7 years of my life trying to understand that mode of being and its implications and its relation to the world at large. And doing so has led to an interest in scientific literatures about complexity and consciousness and evolutionary psychology, hemispheric differences, cognitive science, and more. And we're going to talk about all of those in this series of videos. Louis Sass is a psychiatrist and kind of a polymath, and he wrote this book in 1992 called Madness and Modernism. And in that book, he documents the overlap between modernist and postmodernist culture, so that's art, literature, and philosophy, and the thought patterns that are characteristic of schizophrenia or madness. And the implication of his book, the primary implication of his book, is that in the wake of the death of God, right, in the wake of our loss of this overarching interpretation of the world, intellectual and artistic culture experienced this kind of collective descent into madness, a collective psychosis. And we'll discuss later on, I think in part 6 of this series, this is not really that surprising, right? What happened to our culture in response to the death of God is analogous, is really deeply analogous to what happens in acute psychosis. And to just foreshadow that a little bit, right? The consequence of the death of God, right? The loss of this overarching interpretation of the world within intellectual and artistic culture that resulted in a kind of extreme relativism. And we have to keep in mind, right? We have to understand, like, intellectual culture in the Western world was obsessed with Christianity for a very long time. Basically, all of our intellectual effort was put towards interpreting everything within a Christian Aristotelian framework for a long time. And the loss of that dominant interpretation brought about a kind of extreme relativism. That extreme relativism was brought about by the loss of any overarching perspective by which we could judge the world and act in the world. And Louis Sass says this about it, and I quote, "The consequence of such proliferation of perspectives is the loss of any single overarching perspective, any selective principle or hierarchy of significance, which results in the conjuring of a world where anything can stand for anything, where the merest detail can loom up as the most momentous event, and a heroism of doubt can lead to a refusal or incapacity to make any choices at all." End quote. And that idea that anything can stand for anything, like, that's postmodernism basically in a nutshell, right? Like, all texts are open to any kind of interpretation. That's the postmodern claim, basically, and it's wrong and it's stupid, but it's understandable to some extent in the wake of the loss of this overarching perspective that provided a hierarchy of values by which we could interpret the world. And it is the case that value judgments are impossible without some kind of stable perspective, which allows you some kind of stable perspective or value judgment, which allows you to rank order things in terms of their significance or their relevance. And this is what Nietzsche was referring to, in that quote earlier when he said that the future philosopher, right, all the sciences have paved the way for the task of the philosopher, which is to fix the hierarchy of values, right? And given this analysis by Sass, which links the postmodern condition to madness, right? It's no coincidence that Nietzsche put his declaration of the death of God into the mouth of a madman, right? So that line, right? God is dead. That comes from a passage in the Gay Science, which is called "The Madman," and I'm going to read that here in full. You may have read it already. You can skip this part if you have, but I think it's important to go over it simply because this entire series of videos is really a response to this passage from Nietzsche. And so I'm going to read that passage. This is called "The Madman" from the Gay Science. And I quote, "Have you not heard of that madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning hours, ran to the marketplace and cried incessantly, 'I seek God, I seek God.' As many of those who do not believe in God were standing around just then, he provoked much laughter. 'Why? Did he get lost?' said one. 'Did he lose his way like a child?' said another. 'Or is he hiding? Is he afraid of us? Has he gone on a voyage or emigrated?' Thus they yelled and laughed. The madman jumped into their midst and pierced them with his glances. 'Whither is God?' he cried. 'I shall tell you. We have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers. But how did we do this? How were we able to drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What did we do when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving now? Away from all suns? Are we not plunging continuously, backward, sideward, forward, in all directions? Is there any up or down left? Are we not straying as through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder, Is not night and more night coming on all the while? Must not lanterns be lit in the morning? Do we not hear anything yet of the noise of the gravediggers who are burying God? Do we not smell anything yet of God's decomposition? Gods, too, decompose. God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and most powerful that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must not we ourselves become gods, simply to seem worthy of it? There has never been a greater deed, and whoever is born after us, for the sake of this deed, he will belong to a higher history than all history hitherto. Here the madman fell silent and looked again at his listeners, and they too were silent and stared at him in astonishment. At last he threw his lantern on the ground, and it broke into pieces and went out. I have come too early, he said then. My time is not yet. This tremendous event is still on its way, still wandering. It has not yet reached the ears of men. Lightning and thunder require time. The light of the stars requires time. Deeds, though done, still require time to be seen and heard. This deed is still more distant from them than the most distant stars, and yet they have done it themselves. End quote. Well, Nietzsche's a little dramatic. We've established that. But that is what this series is a response to. And Nietzsche wrote that 140 years ago. And so the pertinent question here is whether the madman's time has come yet. I think it has. So what does any of this have to do with me? Well, I've kind of talked about that a little bit, but this is kind of cheesy, but it is the way I thought about it. And so the recovery from my psychoses, was facilitated by my attempt, sometimes unsuccessful, but an attempt nonetheless, to enact a particular mode of being. And given the overlap between our cultural problem, as described by Louis Sass and Nietzsche, and madness, let's say, my hope is that the solution to my personal problem may have some relevance to our social problem as well. It might have some social utility. I'm going to articulate that solution as best I can in this series with reference to the relevant scientific literatures. And I do think it has been a solution to the problem, right? Which is not to say that everything is, perfect in my life these days. I fuck up all the time and I make mistakes all the time, but things are so much better now than they were 7 years ago that it's hard to fathom. And, it's clear to me that I'm on a much better trajectory than I was 7 years ago. And, despite the fact that I make all sorts of mistakes, it doesn't matter, right? It has been a solution to the problem anyways. And so I'm going to present that solution in the context of a broader scientific worldview, right? And I'm going to argue, of course, this argument is based largely on the work of Jordan Peterson, that this solution is properly understood the same as the solution that has been represented in these so-called hero mythologies forever. So Jordan Peterson described that as such, and I quote, it's from a 2013 book chapter. The great myths of mankind are not theories of objective existence. They are, instead, imaginative roadmaps to being in the world. They have emerged painstakingly, piecemeal, as a consequence of our continual close self-observation, our developing understanding of the patterns of action that are essentially adaptive, and their representation in symbolic, narrative, and dramatic form. We tell stories about how to play, not about how to play the game, but about how to play the metagame, the game of games. And that goes something like this. When chaos threatens, confront it as quickly as possible. Eyes open, voluntarily. Activate the neural circuitry underlying active exploration, inhibiting confusion, fear, and the generation of damaging stress responses, and not the circuitry of freezing and escape. Cut the unknown into pieces. Take it apart with hands, thumbs, and mind, and formulate or reformulate the world. Free the valuable gold from the dragon of chaos. Transform leaden inertia into gilded action. Enhance your status and gain the virgin maiden, just like the first of your tree-dwelling ancestors who struck a predatory snake with a stick, chased it away, and earned the eternal gratitude of mistress, mother, and group. end quote. And that is the fundamental story, right? You're in the safe tree, you're in the safety of your tree, and along comes the snake. And what do, right? Well, one option is to run away in fear, right? And maybe you'll survive that, but everybody will think you're kind of a dork. And so the better option, potentially, is to grab the stick and to try to whack the snake. Right? And, we tell stories about people who wax snakes with sticks, right? We like those people. And that is the basic story, right? Relative safety, the anomaly comes along, and you confront the anomaly head on. Right? That's the basic myth. That's the basic hero myth. And we'll see how that plays out throughout the series. So in this Akira the Don video called Happiness is Fleeting, Jordan Peterson says this, and I quote, "That place where the meaning and the fact are conjoined, that's the proper place to lecture from. What you want to do as an academic is to tell your students about something that you've encountered, that you've fallen in love with, to communicate that commitment you have to beauty and to truth and to literature. It isn't enough to say what they are and to transmit them. It's to manifest yourself as a living part of that tradition and to show yourself thereby as a model for living out what that tradition represents, and to show that that's so much better than a short-term pleasure-seeking nihilism. They're not even in the same conceptual universe." And of course, that is what I've attempted to do in relation to the ideas I'll be presenting in this series. Now, unsuccessfully often, right? But nevertheless, I have made the attempt, and it's worked out okay so far, despite my mistakes. As I said before, I mean, despite the fact that I do fuck up quite a bit, things are so much better now than they were 7 years ago. It's almost unbelievable, And so. And I'm far from the first person to say that in relation to Jordan's work, right? I mean, and many people have said almost that exact same thing about the effect that this worldview has had on their action in the world, right, on their life, which is really interesting that information can do that, but I think it's true. So I have 10 parts planned for the series. I may change things up a little bit as we go. I do tend to change things on the fly every once in a while, but these are the 10 parts of the series that I have planned. Some of these will have multiple videos associated with them. So there may be more than one video associated with each part. So the first part is just this, the introduction and context. And part two will be called Mythology as a Collective Dream. I'll be putting forward a theory about the function, the biological function, let's say, of mythological narratives. It will be a synthesis of the work of Eric Hole, the neuroscientist Eric Hole, John Vervaeke, and Jordan Peterson's work. Part 3 is called The Process of Complexification, and I'm going to review the scientific evidence for the idea that there is a general process underlying the complexification of everything. We'll see how that can provide a response to nihilism, to the problem of value as described by Nietzsche. And in the 4th video, we'll talk about consciousness, the scientific study of consciousness, and how that relates to this process of complexification, how it relates to the hero myth, and so on. The 5th video is going to be the historical analysis, or the 5th part, anyways, I should say part. That will be the historical analysis. It's called The Rise of the Left Hemisphere. You may be familiar with Ian McGilchrist's work, and it'll be kind of an extension of Ian McGilchrist's ideas and relating that to some other scientific literatures. The 6th video is called The Death of God, and it will be an outline of some of the implications of the meaning crisis, how this has played out in our culture. The 7th video, or the 7th part, is called The Epistemic Crisis, or the Crisis of Sense-Making. It is the case that we have access to more information in the modern world than anybody ever has before, and at the same time it's becoming more difficult to separate fact from fiction, or at least it's becoming more difficult for us to have any shared conception of the facts inherent to the world. And this is especially true politically. We have a situation where people on either side of the political aisle occupy entirely different worlds, basically. And that's a big problem, and I think it's related to the problem that I'll be dealing with in this series of videos. The 8th part of the series is called The Will to Power, and I'll be comparing the solution that I've put forward to the solution that Nietzsche put forward to the problem of nihilism, and I'll make the case that really, properly understood, they are the same, despite differences in vocabulary and differences in the kind of evidence we're looking to, because, of course, Nietzsche didn't have modern scientific evidence. They are essentially the same solution. Part 9 will be a discussion of the psychology of meaning. right? So what does it mean when somebody says that they have a meaningful life or that their life is meaningless? What does it mean when somebody says that they have meaningful experiences or that an experience was meaningful, right? Sometimes a conversation is meaningful, and sometimes it isn't. Sometimes we say sex is meaningful, and sometimes it isn't. What's the difference, right? Why do we make that distinction, and what does it have to do with our psychology? And what is the function of that subjective sense of meaning from an evolutionary perspective? The 10th part in the series is called Finding God, and it's kind of a synthesis of everything that came before. We'll be putting everything together and putting forward a coherent response to what John Vervaeke calls the meaning crisis. So I said earlier, right, that Maps of Meaning has served as the foundation out of which the ideas in this series have emerged, and that is the case. In Maps of Meaning, Jordan Peterson showed how there was a particular pattern, which is really a process, that manifests at multiple levels of analysis, and he talked about it in terms of mythology, in terms of phenomenology, our experience of the world, in terms of neuroscience, in terms of cybernetic systems, and in some more things. But my claim is a little bit more radical than Jordan Peterson's claim, I think. My claim is that this process plays out at every level of analysis, and that our participation in this process is of ultimate value. And I think that that claim will be, it's really not even my claim. As long as you understand the relation between this process that Jordan Peterson is talking about and some modern scientific literatures, that claim is a claim that has been made in mainstream scientific literature. So much of this series is going to be spent justifying that claim or those claims with reference to the relevant scientific literatures. And I will refer to a number of scientific literatures that were either unavailable to Jordan Peterson at the time he wrote Maps of Meaning or that he was unaware of at the time. So like self-organized criticality, which is something we'll talk about in part 2. That was around when Jordan was writing Maps of Meaning, but it was very obscure and there's no way he could have known about it, even though I think it's clearly relevant to his thesis. So here I will start. So I'm going to get into a little bit of content now. I'm going to start by attempting to explain why it is that we should pay attention to mythology or mythological narratives at all. Because I suspect that if you're somebody who is a relatively scientifically minded person, you may have the attitude that mythological narratives are nothing but superstitious bullshit. And I think that's wrong. That these are not mere fairy tales, right? They might be fairy tales, but they're not mere fairy tales. And many people look at these narratives with nothing but contempt. And I think that's the wrong attitude. I don't think that's the most reasonable attitude to have towards these kinds of narratives. And so I'm going to read something that Jordan said in Maps of Meaning about this. And I don't expect this to convince anybody, but I do think it should at least raise some questions about this issue. And so I'm going to quote him here. He said, "How is it that complex and admirable ancient civilizations could have developed and flourished initially if they were predicated upon nonsense? If a culture survives and grows, does that not indicate in some profound way that the ideas it is based upon are valid? Is it actually sensible to argue that persistently successful traditions are based on ideas that are simply wrong, regardless of their utility? Is it not more likely that we just do not know how it could be that traditional notions are right, given their appearance of extreme irrationality? Is it not likely that this indicates modern philosophical ignorance rather than ancestral philosophical error?" So again, I don't expect that to convince anybody, but it should at least raise some questions, right? These, human beings have spent a tremendous amount of time and effort supporting these mythological worldviews through art and literature and ritual and drama and all of this stuff, right? What were we doing, right? Why, and from an evolutionary perspective, right, we might think like if that was really dysfunctional or even if it was neutral, right, it should have been selected out. So what exactly was going on there? So Jordan says that we have made a philosophical error in relation to this, and he describes this error as such, and I quote, "We have made the great mistake of assuming that the world of spirit described by those who preceded us was the modern world of matter primitively conceptualized. This is not true, at least not in the simple manner we generally believe. The cosmos described by mythology was not the same place known to the practitioners of modern science, but that does not mean it was not real." And so the point here is that mythological narratives are not giving us scientific knowledge, right? Not the same kind of knowledge that the scientific enterprise gives us. They're not meant to be interpreted within that kind of framework. So given that, what kind of knowledge might a myth be attempting to convey? And in order to understand this, Jordan talks about how there are two ways of conceptualizing the world. The older way of conceptualizing the world, the more fundamental way, is the world as a forum for action. The world is a place to act. not a place of things to understand how things relate to each other mechanistically or anything like that, right? The fundamental question that we need to know about the world is not what the world is like or what the world is made of or anything like that, right? That's all very secondary. The fundamental question we need to know about the world is how should we act in the world? And from an evolutionary perspective, that's obviously the case, right? We don't need to know what the world is like fundamentally, right? Like that's a secondary issue. The fundamental question is what should we be doing with ourselves? And so when you're construing the world as a forum for action, the primary questions that you need answered when you observe a thing or you observe an event, the primary question is, what is the motivational significance of that thing or event? What is its implication for how I should act in the world? And the fundamental question is just, how should I act in the world? And so the primary modes of communication, when you're construing the world as a form for action, are ritual and narrative and philosophy, and also drama and art and music and things like that. And Jordan talks about all of that in his work. The other way of conceptualizing the world, right, the newer way of conceptualizing the world, the much more recent way of conceptualizing the world, is the scientific way of conceptualizing the world, and that's the world as a place of objects, the world as a place of things. The primary questions you're asking when you're construing the world as a place of objects are, what are things made of, right? What are their constituent parts? And how is it that things or processes work in mechanistic terms, right, in terms of cause and effect? And the primary modes of communication when you're construing the world in this way are science and philosophy, right? And philosophy sort of straddles both of these worlds. So on the first page of Maps of Meaning, Jordan Peterson laid out the problem that he would be attempting to solve. And this is a little bit technical in terms of how he's written this, but I think it's worth reading, and we'll kind of unpack it when I get done, because the reason it's worth reading is because this is also another way of construing the problem that I'm trying to solve in this series of videos as well. Or an extension of what Jordan was doing in Maps of Meaning. So he said, and I quote, "The world can be validly construed as a forum for action or as a place of things. The former manner of interpretation, more primordial and less clearly understood, finds its expression in the arts or humanities and ritual, drama, literature, and mythology. The world as forum for action is a place of value, a place where all things have meaning. This meaning, which is shaped as a consequence of social interaction, is implication for action, or at a higher level of analysis, implication for the configuration of the interpretive schema that produces or guides action. The latter manner of interpretation, the world as a place of things, finds its formal expression in the methods and theories of science. Science allows for increasingly precise determination of the consensually validatable properties of things, and for efficient utilization of precisely determined things as tools, once the direction such use is to take has been determined through application of more fundamental narrative processes." So this final claim I want to emphasize because I think it's true, and it's what will be partly driving what I'm doing in this series of videos. He goes on to say, and I quote, "No complete world picture can be generated without the use of both modes of construal. The fact that one mode is generally set at odds with the other means only that the nature of their respective domains remains insufficiently discriminated." And I think that's true. And we now have the scientific tools to understand the domain that the mythological conception of the world is inhabiting. Right? We can now, I think, as far as I'm concerned, we can fully understand this within the strictures of mainstream scientific research and theory. And we're going to talk about that in a lot more detail in part 2. So in Maps of Meaning, Jordan Peterson was attempting to reconcile mythological conceptions of the world with scientific conceptions of the world. And I'm going to extend that project in this series of videos. Science and tradition, right? They both have a kind of epistemic authority, meaning that we should trust them both to some degree. Now, I expect if you're watching this, probably you're somebody who is more scientifically inclined, I think. And the epistemic authority of science is going to be very obvious to you. It's obvious to most people. The power of science is obvious. It cures disease. It gets us to the moon. It creates nuclear weapons. It creates artificial intelligence. It is extremely powerful, and its power is obvious to most people. I think that the epistemic authority of tradition and mythology as well is probably far less obvious to most people. And so I'm going to finish this video with a discussion of why it is that tradition and mythology have a kind of epistemic authority and utility, even if it's not always obvious to us. So in making this case, I'm going to refer to the scientific literature on cultural evolution. And I think that we obviously want to avoid treating traditions as if they are unerringly correct, right? Because obviously we have to transcend our traditions all the time. But I do think it's the case that making recourse to an incorporation of tradition is going to be necessary for any complete worldview. And so you might ask, well, why might that be the case? So the cultural evolutionists like Michael Tomasello and more recently Joseph Henrich have argued that much of our species' power, our intelligence even, comes from what they call cultural evolutionary processes. And so I'm going to read what Joseph Henrich wrote about this in his 2016 book, The Secret of Our Success. And I quote, "Like natural selection, our cultural learning abilities give rise to dumb processes that can, operating over generations, produce practices that are smarter than any individual or even any group. Much of our seeming intelligence actually comes not from raw brainpower or a plethora of instincts, but rather from the accumulated repertoire of mental tools like integers, skills like differentiating right from left, concepts like flywheels, and categories like basic color terms that we inherit culturally from earlier generations," end quote. And so one of the interesting things about cultural evolution is that it can produce practices and institutions and cultural technologies in general that work, that have functionality, but which we cannot fully understand rationally. They call this causal opacity. They are causally opaque to us, right? They work, but we don't have a rational understanding of how or why they work. And so we might ask, how does this happen? So Michael Tomasello, in his 1999 book, The Cultural Origins of Human Cognition, describes this ratcheting process, what's called the cultural ratcheting process, by which cumulative cultural evolution occurs. And this process requires two aspects. There are two aspects to this process. It requires, in the first place, a kind of blind imitation. Human beings imitate their cultural models, and they do this even when it seems to be kind of irrational. So for example, there's a reason why underwear companies get Michael Jordan and other sports stars to advertise their underwear. Right? Well, Michael Jordan is like this cultural model, right? This very prestigious person in our culture, or at least he was. And the fact that he's a good basketball player, of course, has absolutely nothing to do with whether or not he's good at picking the best underwear, right? But it doesn't matter. We imitate cultural models even when we have no rational reason to. This is referred to as over-imitation. And chimpanzees are close cousins. They do not do this. They do not over-imitate. So if you show a chimpanzee how to do something, they will only imitate the actions that are causally relevant to the goal at hand, while humans will imitate even the irrelevant actions. And so I'll give an example of this. So if you put like a banana, if you tie a banana up in the corner of a room so that it's too high for the chimpanzee to get it by itself, and you have like some boxes in the room, you can show the chimpanzee how to get the banana by stacking the boxes up so that it can get the banana. And one of the things you can do is you can take the boxes, put them under the banana, and then do like 3 twirls, and then get on the boxes and get the banana. And the chimpanzee will imitate that, but it will ignore the irrelevant part of that action, right? So if the twirls are irrelevant, it will imitate getting the boxes and putting them under the banana and getting it. But if you show a child something like that, the child will imitate even the irrelevant actions. And so this is over-imitation. Human beings over-imitate. And this blind, seemingly irrational imitation is necessary for the cultural ratcheting effect to take place, because there are lots of practices that human beings engage in, lots of technologies that we use that we do not have a full rational understanding of, right? We just have to blindly imitate. It's not, it may be that we're not smart enough in some cases, but in most cases, I think it's just that we don't have access to enough information to figure out why a particular process works the way it does. Of course, imitation alone cannot drive cultural evolution forward. The other side of that coin is innovation, right? You have to tinker with cultural products every once in a while. Without some level of innovation, cultural products would not change over time. And so Tomasello puts it this way in his book. He says, and I quote, "The argument is that cumulative cultural evolution depends on 2 processes: innovation on the one hand, and imitation, possibly supplemented by instruction. And these processes must take place and a dialectical process over time such that one step in the process enables the next. Right? So you have to imitate in order to innovate later on, or you have to adopt somewhat blindly what came before in order to build upon that later on when it comes to complex cultural products. And so cumulative cultural evolution requires both what is, I would argue, is basically the essentially conservative impulse to imitate and the essentially progressive impulse to tinker. Now, those have been very corrupted in our own political culture, in my opinion, but I do think those are the fundamental conservative and progressive impulses. Tomasello says about this, and I quote, "Basically, none of the complex human artifacts or social practices, including tool industries, symbolic communication, and social institutions, were invented once and for all at a single moment by any one individual or a group of individuals. Rather, what happened was that some individual or group of individuals first invented a primitive version of the artifact or practice, and then some later user or users made a modification, an improvement, that others then adopted, perhaps without change for many generations, at which point some other individual or group of individuals made another modification, which was then learned and used by others, and so on, over historical time in what has sometimes been dubbed the ratchet effect." And so that's the ratchet effect. So I'm going to give a couple examples of cultural products, cultural technologies that people use without having any real rational understanding of how or why they work. So the one that's probably the most common in this literature is manioc. Manioc is a plant. There are indigenous groups that eat this plant, and the plant is poisonous. The plant will give you cyanide poisoning if you eat it without processing it. And the cyanide poisoning, what's interesting about this is the cyanide poisoning takes a few weeks to have an effect. And it's going to be very difficult to pinpoint where that poison comes from if you're eating a lot of different foods. Nevertheless, there are groups that engage in complex processes to detoxify manioc. And these complex processes, I mean, they have multiple steps and they can be pretty complicated. And if you ask people in these groups why they do this or what it is that they're doing, generally speaking, they can't tell you, right? So they can't tell you that they're detoxifying it, and they definitely can't give you like any sort of chemical analysis of what they're doing, right? So they engage in this detoxifying process without having any rational understanding of what it is that they're doing. Generally, if you ask them, they just say, well, this is how we do it, right? This is how we have always done it. It's a tradition. And so manioc processing is not something that was designed from the top down by some, ultra smart engineer in the past. It's something that evolved from the bottom up over long periods of time because it worked, right? So presumably somebody noticed at some point in time that if you do a particular thing to the manioc, that it makes it more edible, and then that was built upon from there. But it persists because it works, right? It does not persist because anyone has a full rational understanding of it. It just works, and so they adhere to it. The other example I'm going to give is these Balinese water temples. This is also something that's pretty commonly talked about in the literature. And so in Bali, in Indonesia, there are these systems of temples that are used to direct water irrigation. And these temples have on rice farms. And these temples have their own mythology, rituals, and so on, and they are effective. And so I'm going to read what Prevost wrote about this. I'll put the link to this article in the description. Prevost said about this, and I quote, "That the traditional system is effective became apparent when the Indonesian government decided to implement a green revolution in the 1970s. This revolution introduced scientific thinking to agriculture in Indonesia. This policy reduced the role of the Balinese water temples, which were invisible to the consultants that advised the government. This well-intended policy disturbed the delicate balance developed over the centuries. With the introduction of scientific farming, pests returned, and rice yields plummeted. The Indonesian government recognized these problems and rescinded the orders to use specific seeds and chemicals in 1988, allowing farmers to return to their old practices." And so in this case, the old traditional and seemingly irrational system worked better than the new scientific way of doing agriculture. Now, it's definitely not the case that that's going to happen all the time, obviously. I'm a big fan of the scientific enterprise and our development of new technology. The point here is that there are some systems that work without us having any rational understanding of how or why they work. And when we mess with those complex systems, there will always be unintended consequences. And so this system of water irrigation that was used by these Balinese temples, it was something that, again, it evolved over a long period of time. It was not engineered from the top down. And so the cultural evolution literature indicates that there are lots of things, lots of technologies and practices and institutions that work without us knowing exactly how or why they work. And cultural evolution gives us a scientifically grounded reason to respect tradition and to resist large and sudden changes to social institutions. And it is the case, of course, that mythological worldviews, going back to the topic at hand, mythological worldviews have been around for a very, very long time. And we have collectively exerted a tremendous amount of time and effort on the art and ritual and music and architecture and narratives that underlie these worldviews. Why did we do this? Were our ancestors simply delusional? I mean, this wouldn't make sense, from an evolutionary perspective, right? From a cultural evolutionary perspective, it seems very likely that this had some kind of functional utility, else it would have been selected against, because it was a huge amount of time and effort, right? Even if it was just neutral, right, it should have been selected against by cultures that didn't do this sort of thing. And so what is it that our ancestors were doing in their support of these mythological worldviews? What was the function of that? So that is in large part what we're going to talk about in the next video. So I'm going to make the case that mythological narratives have both what you might call epistemic and pragmatic utility. They have a function. They have an important function for both individuals and for groups. And I will argue that despite being literally false, right? So clearly we don't actually believe that there was a guy named Thor or Ramachandran or whatever that was walking around at some point. These mythological narratives are literally false, but there is a sense in which they are more true than reality. And so just to foreshadow that, I'm going to quote Eric Hole, whose work we'll discuss in a lot more detail in the next part of the series. Eric Hole put it this way, and I quote, "Joseph Campbell thought that all narratives were a form of the monomyth or the hero myth. It starts with some call to adventure or change, requires the protagonist to pass a guardian, perhaps meeting a helper or a mentor before facing their challenges, requires a descent into the abyss, and finishes with transformation and atonement. This is so broad that it can describe Star Wars, Harry Potter, or even with a bit of interpretation, Pride and Prejudice. Our desires and goals, our moral landscape, take just as much from the fictional as from the real, and that can be a good thing. There is a sense in which something like the hero myth is actually more true than reality because it offers a generalizability that is impossible for any true narrative to possess." End quote. And so Eric Hole put forward in 2021 this theory about the biological function of dreams. One of the implications of that theory is that myth and other narratives might be serving a similar function as to what dreams serve for individuals. And so we're going to talk about that in the next part of this series. So that is it for part 1, Introduction and Context. Thank you for your time and attention. I hope it's been useful to you in some way, and I hope to see you on part 2. Goodbye.